Today, trains are used for a variety of purposes. In fact, 125 years ago, they were the stronghold for transportation in America. In 1894, in the heart of Chicago, an unexpected conflict arose from the business of train travel. Employees from the Pullman Company orchestrated a walk out of work, which sparked a movement of national protest within the railway industry. The violence and conflict between two social classes that resulted in the Pullman strike and the American Railway Union boycott led to increased recognition of workers' rights and the compromise of the creation of Labor Day. George Pullman moved to Chicago in 1855. His first prominent business venture was in the market of raising buildings, when he lifted structures, such as the Tremont Hotel, feet over the city's muddy plain. Soon, he became one of the most respected people in Chicago. Pullman traveled east to visit his family, and it is told that on this long, uncomfortable train ride, he first had the idea of a passenger sleeping car. Coaches at the time were made of tightly packed rows of hard wooden seats, sweltering hot in the summer and frigid in the winter. Pullman had a vision of comfortable train travel with the creation of luxury sleeping cars. He built what he called the biggest and best car ever, the Pioneer. It featured sleeping berths, bathrooms, and closets. But the new cars were too large to fit on railroad tracks or under bridges. As railroads would not agree to adjust to Pullman standards, the company remained in stasis. And then everything changed. On April 16, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Pullman volunteered the Pioneer to transport Lincoln's body, which was to stop in large cities, back to Illinois. The funeral train garnered the attention of hundreds of people, and soon Pullman sleepers were a wanted commodity in the upper class. From that point onward, the company grew exponentially. At its peak, the company transported 26 million people across America every year. Pullman himself needed a way to draw in employees to support his business, so he went forward with a novel idea. In 1880, Pullman purchased over 4,000 acres to build his new factory. On this land, he also constructed the Pullman neighborhood. It was a company town, catered to appeal to and fit the needs of all his employees. Pullman, advertised as a utopian community for workers, ran exceedingly well for over a decade. Families resided in rows of townhouses, and Pullman himself lived in a lavish estate, the Florence Hotel. It was so well received that people came to view the world's most perfect town from all over the country. In 1893, there was a spike in the economy of Chicago. The World Fair exhibition was hosted on Navy Pier, and Pullman hired hundreds more workers to help fulfill the need for transporting people to and from the fair.
There were people that came to Chicago to the World's Fair because they saw this beautiful image of this place and said, oh, this is a great future. There's going to be prosperity in Chicago.
But in the rush to host the event, locals and visitors alike did not realize the growing state of alarm in the middle class. After the fair, Pullman had a huge problem, a surplus of new workers that were no longer needed. The economy throughout the country had simply expanded too fast to be manageable. Therefore, that same year, the U.S. encountered a massive financial depression, the Panic of 1893. As the requests for sleeping cars declined, Pullman was caught in a tight spot. In order for him to satisfy his investors and continue to sell bonds, he had to make the same profits as he had before. Labor at Pullman was 50 to 60% cheaper than it had been 5 years before. A common laborer would earn about 70 cents to $1 a day. Rent, however, remained the same. Pullman automatically deducted the annual $170 to $200 in rent from each worker. Pullman also continued to deduct large amounts of money for water and gas usage. Eventually, he laid off hundreds of workers who could not concede to his demands in the Depression. Pullman residents had no money to spend on their basic needs, and they became constantly more furious at George Pullman and his company. There was movement in the town for a strike. At this point, a man named Eugene V. Debs stepped in and changed the course of Chicago's history. Debs began his political career by forming the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen in the 1870s.
And they were organized around craft and special trades.
Debs believed that unions created for specific areas of work hindered their ability to find a central cause and come together to prevent companies from oppressing workers' rights. In 1893, he formed the American Railway Union. An organization including most middle-class men with jobs in railways, the ARU's motto was "One for all and all for one." The first strike the ARU organized was the Great Northern Railway Strike. It was successful, and applications were sent in from all over the country. Meanwhile, tensions were rising at Pullman. The ARU gathered the workers and made speeches describing the situation in the town. 2,000 to 3,000 Pullman workers declared their strike in Kensington Turner Hall at 9 o'clock on May 11th. The first day of the strike was June 26. Debs handed responsibility of the strike to his vice president, George W. Howard. Howard correctly predicted that ARU members would soon refuse to handle Pullman cars. In a few weeks, at the plea of the workers, Debs ordered a boycott in sympathy with the strike. All members of the union across America refused to switch, inspect, haul, or transport any trains carrying Pullman cars. In this manner, the ARU was forcing either a negotiation with Pullman or a decision of the railroad officials to drop all Pullman cars.
The boycott was obstructing interstate commerce. There were passenger trains where they cut off Pullman cars and people were left in the middle of nowhere out in Great Plains.
Debs told the union members, "Labor must stand by labor. I ask you to take a manly stand in the aid of men, women, and children who have been ground down by the iron heel of the oppressor." The boycott engulfed the nation like wildfire.
Railroads represented about 60% of the national economy.
By July, the railroads and union were at a stalemate. Meanwhile, George Pullman was facing his own problems. Due to the strike, the popularity of his cars was falling, and their worth crashed by 25%. He held the opinion that an agreement could not be reached, and that he did not hold responsibility for the boycott or for unfair treatment of workers. I think the sympathy of the intelligent American public is with the railroads in this unjust attack. Hundreds of families at Pullman left for new employment as, while the workers had widespread support, they could not survive on no pay indefinitely. 1 month into one of the longest unresolved strikes, the workers had seemingly nothing to show. In the Senate, the strike was the center of discussion. While some members supported the placement of full control of the railway cars to railroad owners, others wished to compromise with the strikers and to not prosecute those who did not engage in violence. Yet, exactly 2 months after the strike was first called, President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops to stall the boycott. It was stated, "The Senate endorses the vigorous measures adopted by the President of the United States to repress by military force the interference of lawless men with the due process of the laws of the United States." The National Guard was sent to restore order, enforce laws, and protect the lives of law-abiding citizens. Nevertheless, conflict followed them everywhere as they dispersed through the country. On the 6th of July, workers began to burn train cars and equipment to the ground. Resulting in 800 to 1,600 destroyed cars, local troops were called in. On July 4th, Cleveland's National Guard were met with cheering crowds and flowers as they paraded down wealthy neighborhoods. In poorer sections, however, they were met with disgust, protest, and violence. Mobs seemed to intensify with the arrival of the troops. Much more railroad property was damaged, and a street of buildings leveled by fire. 3 days later, the strike finally was broken. The National Guard fired randomly into an oncoming throng of assailants. 30 strikers were killed and around 60 wounded. A week later, the boycott was finished and Debs was arrested. Over 1,600 employees had been dismissed and were starving in the streets. To work for Pullman, one had to say they would not be part of a union. Pullman had lost his residential holdings, and the workers had lost their freedom to organize. But while Pullman workers did not seem to gain from their actions, they created the most widespread of all the labor movements of the late 1800s. 40 years later, the ARU's efforts, and those of many others, allowed the creation of the New Deal. While during the strike the majority of the public supported the government, it was mortified by the vulgarity that followed. 1894 was Cleveland's re-election year, and he seized the chance to reconcile with voters. He instituted Labor Day, already a prevalent idea, as a national holiday.
It was important to officially recognize labor in a more formal manner.
The day for which the toilers in past centuries looked forward, that the workers of our day may not only lay down their tools of labor, but upon which they may touch shoulders in marching phalanx and feel the stronger for it. The holiday symbolizes the beginning of a movement in which America began to recognize the significance of the laboring class.
This was the first major attempt to organize an industrial-wide union.
The Pullman strike did not change the course of labor, but it showed how important the working infrastructure of America is, and how every laborer is powerful when they join forces for the common good.